Greetings, loves. It is I, Tactical Girlfriend. Welcome back to the channel. I hope everybody's doing well. Today, I'm going to be talking about cover and concealment. These concepts are generally really pertinent for anyone who orients themselves and arms themselves in a defensive manner against a potential real-world attacker who might be using a firearm. When we go to the flat range and we're shooting at fairly defenseless paper targets that don't shoot back and don't actually move, that's all well and good. Those provide really good shooting metrics, but that alone does not actually teach you how to move and orient yourself in a potential real-world scenario. Even if you aren't armed, this is generally really useful information. If you're in an active shooter situation, you need to find cover or concealment to better protect yourself. So without further ado, let's get into it. In any given situation, the attacker is generally way ahead in the power curve. It's up to the defender to immediately respond to the threat by returning fire and or finding cover and concealment. This allows them to have space between them and the attacker. If the threat continues to be a threat, they can better determine the means of engagement and come out on top. I want to stress that whether the defender responds immediately by returning fire or seeking cover and concealment is extremely situational dependent, especially as the situation evolves relative to what cover and concealment you have, the defender and their abilities, as well as the attacker and their abilities, and the relation of space and time between the two. I also want to preface this presentation by saying that the mechanics around shooting around barriers and angles, room clearing, CQB, all of that is a fairly advanced subject that I will get into in a different video. In this one in particular, we're just going to be focused on what is cover and concealment and what works and what doesn't. Now first, I want to talk about cover. What exactly is cover? Cover is basically any object or surface in which a person can position themselves behind where a round would not penetrate said object or surface. Good examples of this include earth, stone, concrete, or any thick or dense metallic objects. There's also some really bad examples of cover. These include things like grass, brush, trees, wood, drywall, floors, ceilings, and glass, unless of course it's bulletproof. Now there's of course some exceptions to this depending on a scenario, but in general these are going to at best soften the impact of a round or slightly redirect the trajectory of a round, which does not necessarily guarantee your safety. Now there's also some interesting psychology behind cover. People generally like to hug cover and get as close as humanly possible to it. That makes perfect sense if you're under fire, but if you're trying to actually return fire, this becomes a huge problem. You need to make sure that you're very far back from cover so that it doesn't interfere with your movement, your maneuverability, and your weapon system. You want to keep your muzzle behind cover at all times so that you're not overexposing yourself, giving away your position, potentially putting your weapon at risk for being grabbed, and also making sure that you're not overexposing yourself to your target. Cars are also a very interesting source of cover, and there's a lot of points of contention around this because a lot of people really misuse them in real-world scenarios. Cars can provide some good cover. They're also huge bullet magnets. As soon as somebody sees you take cover behind a vehicle, they're probably just going to light the entire thing up. The important thing to know is that the engine block, because of its density, is really effective at stopping rounds. Wheels, less so, but they can, depending on angles and what's being used by the attacker. Regardless, you want to make sure that you keep these things in mind and position yourself accordingly in a defensive scenario. Also, when it comes to taking cover behind cars, it's especially relevant for people to understand how ricochets work. Basically, when a round strikes a hard, flat surface, such as pavement, the round travels in a near parallel trajectory to the surface it hits. In this example, if a round strikes one end of the car between the wheels, that round can skip under the car and strike anything on the other side. That's why it's especially relevant for anybody who is taking cover to make sure that they're behind the wheel well and the engine block. There's actually a really good FBI video from the 1960s, not a Fed post, but it does demonstrate this concept very well. I'm going to include that in the description below. In general, cars are very common in the world, and in plenty of gunfights, they've been used a lot for cover. For this reason, it is really relevant for people to try to train using them as cover, positioning themselves in various locations around them safely, and understanding how to maneuver around them. I recommend that people try doing dry fire practice around cars if they can. If they want to do live fire, that's fine. I generally just recommend that you use a junked car. Don't use your own unless you really don't care about accidentally shooting yours. Next, let's talk about concealment. Concealment basically is any surface or object that prevents visual acquisition between an attacker and a defender. These don't really provide any ballistic advantages, they're permeable, but in general they're still extremely useful in most situations, especially because they're more common than cover. Good examples of this are actually the bad examples I listed under cover. Things like trees, grass, brush, walls, doors, all those things really help hide you and prevent you from being acquired by somebody who would be attacking. Now, it might go without saying, but with cover comes concealment. Use both to set the terms of an engagement and when an enemy can see you and how much of you they can see. Generally, extremities such as your head, your elbows, your arms, your legs, and your feet are all very common things that are overexposed past the threshold of cover and concealment, so make sure that you're very aware of those extremities and keeping them behind cover and concealment as much as you can during an engagement. Tangentially, I also want to add that camouflage is an excellent source of concealment. It's not guaranteed to work all the time, and it's not guaranteed to be effective or practical, so I will be talking about that in a very different video because that is a very different subject altogether. Now, as far as training, there's a lot you can do. If you want to use live fire at the range, you can simply use a target stand as a mock-up for cover and concealment. You can practice using that, positioning yourself around it, getting used to angles, and shooting around that barrier. There's also more advanced training tools such as VTAC barriers. Those are really useful if you have access to those. There's also, of course, again, cars. Again, I don't really recommend using your own or a working car. If you have access to a junked car at a really fancy range, that's great. Also, you can do all this stuff with dry fire. You don't need to fire a single shot to understand the concepts of cover and concealment. You can actually practice all this stuff at home, and I strongly implore you to do a walkthrough of your home, identify what is good cover and concealment, and practice and position yourself around them and understand how to better use those angles. And that wraps up the basics of cover and concealment. If you found this video useful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell too. Also, if you have your own ideas around cover and concealment or training strategies there, I would love to hear more about it in the comments below, so get in there and nerd out. I also want to thank every single person who has ever supported this channel on Patreon, past and present. You keep this channel going, you keep the lights on, and I really couldn't have done it without you. If you want to help chip in, you can always go to patreon.com/tacticalgf. The biggest contributors are named at the end of the video. And that's a wrap. I really appreciate you all tuning in. Please be good to each other out there. And as always, please take care. Bye!